Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share the March 2026 clubs for Spellbinders. So this here is the embossing folder of the month called Solar Flare. Then we have the 3D embossing folder of the month called Urban Grid. So much texture in that one. The clear stamp of the month with the coordinating die is called Good Times. Lots of great sentiments in this set. And then we have the stencil of the month called Burst Mode. I'm going to be using this quite a bit in this video. There is one stencil that does the dots in the corner, and then there's 4 different stencils that do the sun rays to create some really fun backgrounds. Then we have the press and foil plate of the month called Greetings Maker, as well as some prism foil to go with that. Then we have the stitching die of the month called Everyday MVP, and that stitching on this hat really makes it, or really takes it to the next level. This here is the die of the month called Unstoppable, and I'm going to create 2 cards with that. And we have the large die of the month here called Classic Kicks. I absolutely love the shoe in this one. I'm going to create a few different cards with that set. Then we have our #1 fan club bonus item of the month, and then our Edge Effects All Clubs Create exclusive press and foil plate, and I will be using that a lot in this video. You can tell that I really love this plate. Anytime I use press plates, I love the fact that you can use them in the Better Press system as well as the Glimmer system. I'm going to start by using it in the Glimmer system. And I'm going to foil it on some Dahlia cardstock, some Cosmic Sky cardstock, as well as Hammermill cardstock. The Cosmic Sky one, I'm going to be using it for a background. The one on the Dahlia cardstock, I'm going to be using it to die cut a few different pieces throughout this video. And then the one on the Hammermill, I'm going to be using it for a different background. And as well, anytime I do some foiling, I always do the negative foiling as well. So I'll be doing that and using those pieces as well. So I have this on my Glimmer system. It's nice and hot there, and I'm putting it with the foil pretty side facing the plate, then putting my cardstock on there and then the plates, and then pressing that timer button. And once that timer button stops flashing, then I run it through my die cutting machine. You need both the Glimmer system, the heat from the Glimmer system, as well as the pressure from the die cutting machine for doing that hot foiling. I love the random pattern on the back of it, and because it's a press and foil plate, you can get so many different looks to it. So I've got the Cosmic Sky as well as the Dahlia one done. Now I'm doing the one on the Hammermill cardstock. Foiling is a very repetitive process, so there is some waiting time when you're waiting for that timer, but I always love doing my foiling all at once to make sure that I have all of these pieces ready to go while I'm creating. Once I've done doing the background, there's also 4 different sentiments in that Edge Effects All Clubs Create exclusive plate. So I am foiling those with that prism foil as well. I do the negative foiling for those sentiments as well, but I don't actually use them. I always do the positive and the negative. Sometimes the negative foiling, I'll use it as is. Sometimes I'll use it around the edges as a matte, and sometimes I'll use it for specialty cardstock for die cutting. But why it's much easier to do that negative foiling at the same time and have those pieces stored on cardstock rather than the little flimsy pieces of foil that's left over. For the press and foil plate, the Greetings Maker, I'm using the Happy Birthday Greetings, foiling it with that prism foil onto some Cosmic Sky cardstock. And I positioned those so that the die that's included with it will cut those 2 sentiments at once. You could also position them so there's some space in between them and have them as 2 separate strips. If you look at the package, they've got a sentiment created with all the words in the set and different strips for the front of the card. That's a great way to use it as well. I just wanted to create one thick sentiment strip with it, and the 2 words fit within that die, so that was perfect. So once I have those other pieces foiled, I'm ready to do my solid hot foiling. This is my color palette inspiration for this video. I wanted something nice and bright and vibrant, so those are the colors I'm using, plus a few extras, of course. I'm going to start with using the 3D embossing folder of the month. I have some Cascade cardstock here that I've put into that embossing folder using the 3D embossing stacking on my die cutting machine. I'm going to emboss it, and then I'm just going to use an ink pad on top of it to bring that texture from that foiling out. There's some texture that you get right away with that foiling, but there's also some texture that gets brought out when you do a little bit of ink blending on top of it. So there's some really interesting crinkly texture that gets shown when you use some ink on top of it. While I have my die cutting machine out, I'm going to cut that happy birthday sentiment. I am going to be using that sentiment on this card here. I thought it would be a nice bold sentiment on a very simple embossed background. So I'm trimming this piece down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. I always start with larger cardstock and then trim them down after embossing. Sometimes when you're embossing, it skews the measurements. So when possible, I typically will emboss a larger piece of cardstock and then trim it down. For my ink blending, I'm just using some Chipped Sapphire Distress ink. First, I used the pad, rubbing it over that raised surface. And now I'm using a large ink blending brush and just doing some ink blending around the outside edges. And that's when I discovered all the little subtle texture that was in that background that really showed up when there was some ink blending on there. So I am doing this background so that the texture is raised. That's why we see that texture with that dark ink. I'm going to be using it later for another card where I use it where the texture is debossed in there. So I am using some florals from that classic Kicks die set. I have them die cut out of some beeswax cardstock, some carrot cardstock, and then that dahlia cardstock that I did the urban grid foiling on there. It adds interesting texture to the flower, but it also ties the foiling from the flower with the foiling from the sentiment. So I opted to add it in that way. Another option would be to use the solid hot foiling and cut the flower centers from those pieces. I've done that before in the past. I opted not to do that for this one, but that's another great way to add that foiling in there as well and use up those pieces that you may not use as they come out when they're foiled. So with all of my pieces ready, I'm ready to assemble everything to an A2 card base. I'm using some Barely Art glue with a fine lined bottle. This way it works perfectly for assembling small die cuts like those flowers as well as assembling my cards. It gives you that wiggle room to move things in place and shimmy it in place till you have perfect placement, but it doesn't start to catch right away. My sentiment strip with that happy birthday was trimmed down to 4 inches wide, so it fits the same width as that embossed piece. And I'm going to do a few of the flowers in the bottom right corner of that sentiment strips, but most of them are going to be in the top left corner. So again, with that liquid glue, when I go to position those flowers, they're not laid down right away. I can easily move things behind other pieces, and it gives you a little bit of forgiveness that way. I don't want to wait for these flowers to dry before assembling my whole piece because I want to make sure that I can tuck little pieces in areas where I think it needs to be filled out. So typically when I'm doing little floral pieces like this, I will do something in the background. Here it's a stem with some buds on it. Sometimes it'll be a longer leafy stem. Then I will add the florals, and then there's usually some leaf die cuts that I will tuck in last minute, just where I feel it needs to be filled in a little bit more. Now I'm using a lot of florals on here because I think this card needs a pop of color. So I used a lot. You don't have to use this many if you don't want to. Now that I have my florals where I want them to go, I can go and tuck in some leaves. There's 2 different sizes of leaves, so I will be mixing and matching using some of the smaller leaves, some of the larger leaves, but it just fills in those areas, adds another color because the leaf is a different color than those florals, and it just completes the arrangement, if you will. So once I have all of those pieces in place, I will let that dry for a few moments, and then my card is pretty much done. When I put those florals down, you may have noticed I use my fingers to curve the petals. It just gives them a little bit of dimension, and it makes the arrangement not so flat. I do this regularly, and then when I go to glue the pieces down, I only put glue in the center of the floral, so that part is anchored down and it's really easy to stuff or to tuck things underneath each other. So here is the finished card. Really, really pretty, and I love the pop of color those florals give. For my next card, I'm going to be using the Burst Mode Stencil of the Month on the background. I'm going to be using this stencil a few times in the video, and I do the ink blending for the stencil pretty much the same every time because I just really liked the look of it. So I'm starting off with using some squeezed lemonade distress ink. I'm going to be heavier in the center and lighter towards the outside. I want it to look like we have a sun that has light coming out of it. So I made a heavier amount of ink towards the center and lighter towards the outside. I just really liked the look of that, so I just kept on going with it. You could easily use it where it's all nice and even if you really want it to be. I always find with ink blending that it just looks more interesting if there's some areas that are heavier and some areas that are lighter. That second color that I used there was Spiced Marmalade. And then I'm going to go in and use some Abandoned Coral. I'm using the Spellbinders large blending brushes for my stenciling here. And when I do that stenciling, I'm going clockwise as well as counterclockwise. I want to make sure that I don't have a heavier amount of ink going one way than the other way. So I will regularly change the direction of my ink blending brush. So for my next layer here, I just wanted to add a little bit of a different texture. So for my next layer, I'm going to use an interference pad. I'm using Sunset Pink. This one is an exclusive one to scrapbook.com. It's just got such a beautiful pink color. There are other pink interference inks from Lisa Horton Crafts that you could easily swap this out for if you don't have this one. But I really like the color of this pink, as well as the fact that the interference shine to it was more of a goldy yellow color, and I figured that worked well for this. Just like my background, anytime I'm doing the ink blending with the interference inks, I'm going in clockwise and counterclockwise motion. I want to make sure that I have all of the edges fully stenciled and I don't have a heavier amount of ink towards one side than the other. So this last stencil here for the sun rays has the sun in the center and then those rays coming from the outside of that cardstock. Now, all of these inks will rinse off of my stencil nice and easily, so I don't have to worry about using special cleaners or anything to clean them off. I can just run them under a tap with some water. So once I have my ink blending done, I always clean my stencil or my sticky mat off to make sure that I don't have ink there for next time I want to stencil on it. If I clean it off right away, that way it can dry while I am working on whatever I am doing. And next time I go to use it, it's going to be nice and dry. It's also going to be nice and clean. For this background, I'm using the Solar Flare embossing folder of the month. Now, one thing I do is I want to make sure that my texture is raised. There is one way in the embossing folder where you have the details raised and one where they're debossed. So definitely make sure to check that out before you do your embossing. There's little stars on this background and I want to make sure that those are raised because once I have this embossed, I'm going to use some gold ink on there and I want to make sure that those raised edges catch that gold ink. So I'm trimming this down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to put a mat behind this that is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches with that beeswax cardstock. And I'm just using the gold pad from Lisa Horton Crafts. This is such a beautiful gold. I often use this one. It's going to catch the edges really, really nicely. And you can see that it blends kind of in with the colors I have on my background. But when you lift it off of the surface and tilt it into the light, you get that beautiful gold shine on those raised edges. So I use it directly from the pad. So I'll have some areas that are lighter, some areas that are darker. I just prefer the look of it. Again, same with the stenciling. I like it when there's some areas that are darker and some areas that are lighter. I think it looks a little bit more visually interesting. For the sentiment, I'm using one of the foiled sentiments from that Edge Effects Club Create exclusive press and foil plate. I ink blended that with that Sunset Pink interference ink so that it pops off of the background there. Now, I mentioned before that I was using some beeswax cardstock for a mat here. I mixed my cards up. For this one, I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches and I didn't do a mat around it, but you could easily trim it down just a little bit more. I think it would also look great with a mat inked with that Sunset Pink interference ink. For most of the cards in this video, I typically will do mats around my cards, but for most of the cards in this video, I don't. I wanted those backgrounds to show off a lot. So I think there's only one card in this whole video that I did a mat around it. The rest of them are without mats around them. And really most of the reasoning for that is because a lot of my backgrounds use that Edge Effects press and foil plate because I really liked the edge around it. I didn't want to cut too much off of that. I didn't want to lose that. So I cut as little as possible. I still wanted to see the white from my card base, but I didn't want to cut the edges around that press and foil plate background. So I have one of the foiled backgrounds here that I'm using the dot part of that stencil on, using some Hickory Smoke Distress ink first, and then I'm going to do my sun rays on there. So when I go and place these on there, there's the edges of the pattern that I am matching up with the edges of the cardstock. So I'm doing this ink blending the same in the same colors in the same order as I did the last one. The only thing I added was using the Hickory Smoke for the dots or the dot layer of the stencil background. I really liked the dot effect on that press and foil plate. So I wanted to echo it in at least one of the backgrounds here. So I did it for this one. I just did it in Hickory Smoke ink. I didn't want to have it in a completely different color ink for this particular one for the look I was going for, but I love the look of the Sunburst pattern behind that foiled image. I think it just looks so pretty, and that foil resists the distress ink. So you get a completely different look than if you are ink blending on just a plain piece of cardstock. So that first color that I used, just like my last background, was the Squeeze Lemonade. Then I used the Spiced Marmalade. Now I'm using Abandoned Coral. And again, just like the last background, I'm heavier in the center and lighter towards the outside. I just really like the look of that. But again, if you want, you can be even amount or even just as heavy on the whole surface if you want that particular look. And I just really liked the color combo of this together, but you could always swap it out. I think it would work well with many different color combinations. So just like the last one, the last color I'm using here is that Sunset Pink Interference ink. Now you could change these colors up and use the yellow for this because we have the sun in the center. I just really like that bright pop of pink in the center. I thought it just kind of made everything pop and made it a little bit interesting. Now, once the stenciled background is done, the one thing that should be done that I realized after the fact that I didn't do is you should use a dry cloth on that surface or a dry paper towel and remove any of the ink from the foiled areas. That foiling resists the ink, so that ink will stay wet on top of there. It will never dry. And if it stays on there and it's wet, it's going to likely go onto your fingers and then transfer to other places. So best to use a paper towel or dry cloth and wipe that ink off to make sure that you don't get ink where you don't want it to go. This is the background here that I used the beeswax matte behind it. So this background I trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and then I trimmed that beeswax piece to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. For this card and the next card, I'm using this Unstoppable Die of the Month. I wanted to create one with like a day look and one with a night look. So this one here is the bright, vibrant day look. Now that Unstoppable die set, you can make it so the legs swing. It's one of those little, just like one of the dancing dies that Spellbinders does. So I'm going to do that for this one. For the second card, I'm just going to glue them flat so that they don't move, but just know that you can do it either way. You can have that interactive element on your card, or you can glue it together so that it doesn't move on your. So I have all the pieces for my little Supergirl here laid out on my surface. When I have pieces like this that glue together to create a full image, if you will, first of all, when you do your die cutting, the dies will regularly have an area that it puts an impression where an upper layer is supposed to go to make it easy to put them together. The other thing I like to do is place them on my surface so they're kind of in a order where they're supposed to go. So it makes it really easy to find those pieces. I'm not digging through a pile to find certain pieces. I can make sure that I have everything ready to go before I start to assemble. And then it's really easy to assemble those, knowing exactly which piece goes where and having them all laid out in front of you. They look overwhelming. Things like this look overwhelming when you see all those little teeny tiny pieces. But once you start assembling them, they're really not that overwhelming, as well as the fact that once you organize them and have everything in its place so that it's ready to just grab and go, it makes it easier as well. The other thing, when you have dies like this that have all those pieces, it just gives it so much more interesting detail to it, as well as some natural dimension because of those layers of cardstock. This die set also has some clouds here, so I have those die cut out of some white cardstock, and I just used that ink blending brush with the Hickory Smoke on it to do a little bit of shading underneath the clouds, give them a little bit of visual dimension that way. I'm using that Sunset Pink Interference pad to add a little bit of shimmer around the outside edges for my sentiment, as well as the bottom part of that cape. I did it just with that brush in my hand, but then for the cape part, I went and grabbed my sticky mat so that I could get it a little bit more gradual, so it wasn't, it didn't have any harsh lines to it. So for that interactive element to this card, you want to have some foam pop dots that are circles, and you want to make sure that your circles are smaller than that hole at the top of the legs. That way it has room to move. They kind of hang on that foam pop dot and it kind of swings from there. So you want to make sure that you don't have a foam pop dot that's exactly the same size or too close in size. You want to give it a little bit of room to move. So before I put that element on there, I'm going to glue my clouds down to my surface. So I glued a couple on there that were pretty much the whole cloud on there, a little bit off of the edges. I'll trim trim that off once that glue is dry. And then I take one of my clouds and use my shears just to trim it in half. I always like it when some of those elements go off the card. I think, again, it looks a little bit more interesting. It looks a little bit more believable too to have some elements go off the card. Then I position the two pieces for my Supergirl to make sure that I have those legs placed properly. So you put the foam dot in the hole of that leg. The upper body needs foam pop dots on that whole thing, but you want to make sure to avoid where those legs attach. You want to give it some space so those legs can swing. So I am making sure to put my pop dots higher up as well as farther out to make sure that those legs have room to swing on them. Now I have it so that my cape is off of that card. I want to see a lot of that background, so I didn't want to cover it up too much. If you don't want your cape going off, you can put the Supergirl more centered on the card. I am going to leave that cape going off and I'm not going to cut it off. I am going to cut off the excess part of the clouds though. So it would be a card that would need a little bit larger envelope because of that. And again, like I said, if you wanted to have it so it wasn't like that, you could also just put her a little bit more central to the card, or you could cut the cape off like I cut the clouds off, but I do think it looks more interesting with the cape hole there. So here is our finished card, and you can see how the legs just swing on that foam pop dot. Now I want to do a similar card here, but I'm going to change a few things up. Like I said before, I wanted to have a daytime Supergirl and a nighttime one. So this is my foiled edge accent or edge effects plate on that Cosmic Sky cardstock. I'm going to use two different interference inks on that background. I use interference inks a lot. They're my favorite ink to work with sometimes because they're like magic pads. They have one look on lighter white cardstock and a completely different look on dark cardstock. I have a whole playlist just with videos that I use interference inks in, so if you're looking for more inspiration, you'll find it in that playlist. The first color here that I'm using is Galaxy Dream. The second color I'm using here is Night Sky. Now the Galaxy Dream on white or light cardstock, it's kind of like a bluey, smoky blue color. And then on the dark cardstock, which is what you're seeing here, is more of a pink tone. The Night Sky has more of a gray look to it on white or light cardstock, but on dark cardstock you see gold, which is what you're seeing on this background. I'm not completely covering that Cosmic Sky. I still want to see it, but I wanted to add some shimmery accents to that background that were going to complement that foil nicely. I wanted it almost to look a little bit like a galaxy. So once I have that ink blended there, I'm going to use a dry cloth to remove any of that ink from the foil. Just like I mentioned before, that ink is not going to dry on the foil, so you want to make sure to remove it so you don't get it on your fingers and transfer it elsewhere. Then I have my sentiment here. I've layered them together. I have the upper layer done with the Cascade cardstock. The lower layer is with that Cosmic Sky. I'm just using the Galaxy Dream interference ink, so we're really only seeing the blue because that light is that cardstock for my sentiment there is a lighter color. We're just seeing the lighter tone to it, but it will have a little bit of shimmer to it. This background here I'm trimming down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then I'm ready to start gluing it onto my card. So I have an A2 card base that I have here, and I did them so that you could see the A2 card base. I like that white frame around it, but you could leave it so you don't trim it and have it that full card front if you want. I have one cloud left from the last card I did, so I'm going to use that on this one. It just gives her a place to sit. Here you see what that Galaxy Dream ink pad looks like on light cardstock. So a completely different color than what shows up on the dark cardstock. So the dark cardstock was the pink tones that you see in the background here. So like I said, magic pad. For this particular background, I am putting her closer to the center because I don't have that sun in the center that I want to be able to see, so I don't have to avoid that. So I have her a little bit more toward the center. Her cape still goes a little bit off to the side. I think it just looks a little bit more interesting when she's a little bit off to the side, but not nearly as much as that last card. Then I add the sentiment to the bottom, and then I have a bunch of stars here that are die cut. This is from that Unstoppable die set. I have them die cut out of some gold treasured cardstock. I have the mirror one done, and I also have this same cardstock that I used to die cut the crown that she's wearing, as well as a little shield on her cape. I use this same cardstock for the last card as well. So I just put dots of that Barely Art glue on my background, and there's a few different sizes to those stars. I'll typically have the larger sizes closer to my die cut element, my main die cut element. In this case, it's that little Supergirl, and then smaller ones going out from there. So we have two different shiny elements. We have that prism foil as well as the mirror gold cardstock, and I just love the look of those two together for that particular background. For this next card here, I'm gonna start using the classic Kicks die set. So I'm gonna make 3 cards with this. This one here focuses on those little barbecue tools as well as the beer bottle. And then the next 2, I'm going to be using the shoe die because I absolutely love it and had a couple different ways that I wanted to use it. So for this here, I have those barbecue tools die cut out of silver treasured cardstock, but in the matte form. I wanted them to be silver, but I wanted them to not be as shiny as the stars from the last one. So it's in the matte form. I have the handles to those tools die cut out of acorn cardstock and just glued them on top. My beer bottle there is done with some fern cardstock, and then the label and stuff like that are done with some white cardstock. I want those pieces to have a little bit of visual dimension to them, but not necessarily too much. Those die cuts are really quite small, so I don't need to do a lot of ink blending on them. I just used my brush with the gray with the hickory smoke ink on there and just use whatever was left on the brush for the label on that bottle. For my background, I have some fawn cardstock here that I am taping to my 3D embossing folder, the Urban Grid embossing folder. I used a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape in order to tape that piece in place, and then I'm inking the opposite side with ground espresso distress ink. So I have placed my cardstock in this folder this time so that my details deboss in that. So when I go to ink that folder, I am inking the raised layers from the last card. So one thing that you can do is you can do it both ways and just see which way looks best for you. I wanted those pieces debossed for this particular one. In my mind, I was thinking barbecued meat for the background-ish. Obviously, it doesn't really totally look like that. It does look like more of a masculine background because of the brown color as well as the darker details debossed in there. I'm trimming this down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and then I'm going to use that ink to ink blend around it to get those details in there. I just really like this for kind of a masculine background. I just thought it looked a little bit interesting behind, or to put behind, those barbecue tools. So I put my piece, once it's trimmed down, on that sticky mat and then use my large blending brush to blend around those edges. There is a sentiment in the Good Times clear stamp and die of the month that I thought was going to be perfect for the card, and it said, "For the backyard boss." So before doing anything with this stamp set, I use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It just removes any possible manufacturing residue. And then I use a soft brush in order to brush any eraser bits off. That way that ink is, or that stamp is going to take ink just a little bit better. I'm using my Misty stamping tool to stamp that sentiment. That way I can stamp it a couple times, making sure it goes in exactly the same spot to get a nice crisp sentiment. And I'm using that ground espresso distress ink. Once I have that stamped, I can use the matching die, tape it in place with some Best Ever Craft tape, and then die cut it. By taping it in place, I can make sure that it's not going to move around on me in the die cutting machine, and I don't have to worry about it too much while it's going through. So now that we have all of the pieces ready for our card, we can start to assemble it. So I have an A2 card base that I'm going to use, and I'm going to glue that embossed surface to it. Now, because we did the embossing here so that the raised edge was debossed basically, I want to make sure to be fairly liberal with my glue and use that glue on top of those raised edges that have contact with the card base below. Then I'm putting those barbecue utensils on there. I'm just kind of having them in a kind of haphazard manner on the front. I always like my longer details on the left side of my card when they're supposed to be vertical. And then I'm going to put the sentiment to the bottom right there. I did it this way so that you see as much of that embossed background as well. But you could always, if you wanted, change it up a little bit and center those pieces towards the center and then have the sentiment kind of either going across it or right below it. That's another option here. So for this card, I'm going to use the shoes for the Urban Kicks. I have a upper layer from that shoe die cut out of that piece that I foiled with that Edge Effects die. Now, I just thought it would add some fun pattern to that shoe, make it a little bit more interesting. These shoes look like Converse and they come in so many fun patterns and so many different ways. So I wanted to have a lot of fun with it. So for this one, I have the pieces die cut out of Dahlia cardstock as well as Wildberry cardstock. Now, before I had the idea to use the foiled piece for my shoe, I die cut it out of some plain Dahlia cardstock, which is the piece that I just glued on there. So I have these gluing on in the wrong order, and this is the point where I realize my mistake. So that second piece that was, or the upper layer of the shoe that was supposed to go on there was supposed to be my foiled piece here. Now I can easily take this bottom strip off simply because I've just glued it on, but that toe to the shoe has likely already set by now, or mostly set. So I just cut the tip of the shoe off so that I could glue this on easily. There's a little line there, so it was really easy to glue it or to cut it in the exact right place. Then I can put that base of the shoe on there. So if you do it the same way as I did, don't cut two parts to the front of the shoe. It makes it a little bit more confusing. It does add a little bit of extra dimension to it though. In the end, it all looks just fine, and I really love that extra texture that you get from the foiled image from that Edge Effects plate. So then we can glue the front part to the sole of the shoe as well as a little stripe on the sole, and then we have that little layer or that little label there that goes on the side. There's a few pieces for the laces. I have them die cut out of white. I think they would look great die cut out of black as well, echoing the black stripe on the sole of the shoe. Now both of the shoes that I create for the two cards that I'm creating with the shoe end up having a little bit more of a feminine look to them, but easy enough to do this in more masculine colors. You could do that foiled detail, but you could do it on like blue or brown or black cardstock and do it that way. So there's so many different ways to customize this, and I think this would be great for cards for a teen, especially one that loves shoes. I have a husband that absolutely loves Vans and has far too many of them. So this shoe I think would be perfect for so many people, especially shoe lovers. For the background for this card, I'm using one of the solid hot foiled backgrounds from that Urban Grid. I used some black ink around those outside edges so that it would tie in with the black elements from the shoe. And then I chose one of the foiled sentiments and ink blended that with black as well to make that sentiment pop just a little bit more. Now again, just like before, that foil is going to resist the ink. So once you've done doing that ink blending on there, you want to use a dry cloth or paper towel in order to remove any of that ink from on top of that foil. Cleans it up a little bit better. You don't have the streaks of the ink there and less chance of getting on your fingers. So then I'm going to glue the shoe on, and I'm going to start assembling those flowers. So these flowers and stems are all from this same die set here. I've die cut the greens out of some fern cardstock, and then the flowers are die cut out of some carrot as well as beeswax cardstock. And then we have some flowers die cut out of the wildberry cardstock. The wildberry on the shoe, I used it for the back parts or the tongue of the shoe. So when I go to glue the flowers towards the shoe, it's going right against the dahlia. So we have a little bit of color difference there. Just like the first card with my flowers, I'm using my fingers to curve the petals just a little bit, give them a little bit more shape. And when I go to glue them onto my shoe, I'm only putting glue in the center of the flower so that I have some space to tuck things underneath there. Now I create floral things like this quite often. I've done it for many years, so I'm really quite comfortable doing it and knowing how it's going to look, or being quite sure how it's going to look. First of all, that liquid glue gives you a little bit of wiggle room to move things out of the way. Another option here would be to put that clear block that I use to glue things in place and hold things in place, and put your arrangement on top of there so that you can see how it's going to look on your background. Then you can lift that block up, move it to the side, and know where you had intended to put everything, and then glue them in place. That's another way to kind of create your arrangement and know how it's going to look on that background. Once I have my flowers in place, I'm ready to glue my sentiment down there. And I did it with black so that it would show up nicely on that foiled background. This is an instance where I did use foil on a background. I typically don't, but I liked the look of that pattern and the fact that we could ink around the edges and tie in the black ink with the black details on the shoe. The last step here is I put a little bit of stickles in the center of the flowers just to give them a touch of sparkle as well as a little bit of a different texture. And then I move that over to the side. For my next card, I'm going to create another shoe, but the first thing I'm going to do is grab that press and foil plate. I'm going to use it in the Better Press system. So similar to my last card, I'm going to use it to create texture and cardstock to die cut that same layer of the shoe, but I wanted to do it in a different way. Last time I did it with the foiled image. This time I'm going to do it with the inked image in the Better Press system. I'm just using some black soot distress ink on hammer mill cardstock, inking that plate, putting the clear plate to the base, and then running it through my die cutting machine to press that image onto the cardstock. And then I'm ready to die cut that piece out for my shoe. Now, you could also use this for your background, but I'm not going to use that for this particular card. The great thing about that Better Press system is you can use it for simple backgrounds just with ink and paper, or you can heat emboss the press plates on there. I'm going to use the sentiment or one of the sentiments from the press and foil plate in the Better Press system as well, using it with just a scrap of cardstock. And put that plate towards the bottom, and I can kind of line up the upper plate to the Better Press system with the plate at the bottom to make sure that I have my cardstock in the right spot. Then I'm using that same ink to ink that plate up, make sure that it hasn't moved on me. I'll move it right back if it has. Then I can put that clear plate to the base and once again run it through my die cutting machine to press that image into place, or that sentiment into place. Now for these sentiments here, there's not a die that goes with them, so I am going to use my trimmer and I'm just going to line up the edges to that sentiment along the edges of the guard ruler, that clear plate there of my guillotine trimmer. Then I turn it the opposite way and I do the same thing, but when I do it the opposite way, I also pay attention to how much space there is on my the steel part of the trimmer to make sure that it's nice and straight, and then I can trim down those edges from that sentiment strip there. So now I'm ready to die cut my shoe, and I'm going to ink blend on top of it with the interference ink. So I'm using that Galaxy Dream that I had used on the background with the Unstoppable die set. I'm also using that same Sunset Pink that I've used a few times with the Stencil of the Month. This time I'm adding in the orange, which is Pumpkin Spice. So I'm going to have kind of an ombre look going from blue to pink to orange. Now, anywhere that this ink is on top of that black ink, we're going to see more of the interference color to it. But even on the light color pieces, we're still going to see some of that shimmer to it. So it's going to give it a really nice finish. The back layers for this shoe, I used some Raven cardstock so that the colors on the front were nice and vibrant. And I'm also using black for the sole of the shoe. That way the colors just really pop on the black. I always love bright colors on top of black or paired with black. I think it just shows them off even more. So once I have the front layer of the shoe onto those black pieces, I can put the toe of the shoe on and then the sole, and then there's a front piece of the sole that has some texture to it that can get glued on there. For the label on this shoe, I did that out of black as well. And then for this one, I did white as that little stripe on the shoe. I wanted it to kind of be opposite to what my last one was. So I did the sole and the background a little bit darker, so those colors just showed up a little bit better. I did use black for the laces for this. You could easily swap those out and do white ones if you wanted them to echo the white line on the bottom of the shoe. But what I plan to do here is use a white gel pen to add some white accents to it, to just kind of brighten it up just a little bit more. The background piece for this card was created the same way I created the cardstock to die cut that piece for the shoe. So it's using black soot distress ink on white hammer mill cardstock, and then I'm doing a little bit of ink blending around the outside edges with that Sunset Pink interference ink. It's just going to add that touch of pink. It's going to add that bit of shimmer. I'm leaving the center of it white though. I don't want to darken everything. I want to have a white background against the darker shoe. But by doing the edges like this, it makes that background not quite as stark, and it just ties in the pink color from the shoe with that background. So this has already been trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, so it's ready to go. I will typically trim my backgrounds down before I do my ink blending on them. When it comes to interference inks, it doesn't necessarily matter, but when it comes to ink blending backgrounds with like dye-based inks, I always find it's a little bit heavier around the outside edges, and I like that look, so I don't want to cut it off. So I will typically trim my background backgrounds down first, and then I will do my ink blending. I also use that same sunset pink on the sentiment for this card, and now we're ready to start assembling. So I'm going to glue the background to the base of the card. This card's a little bit more simple. I'm not doing the florals that I did for the last card, but I just love the look of that edge effects plate on my background, as well as using it for the shoe. You can tell because I've used it for a lot of different things, and I'm going to be using it for a lot of different things for the other cards that I'm creating, that I really love that plate. So it's a great one for both foiling as well as using in the Better Press system. That sentiment there was ink blended with that pumpkin spice interference ink. So again, it's a nice pop of color and coordinates with the color on the shoe. Once I have those in place, I'm going to use that gel pen there, and I'm going to just use it to color in the indents on the front part of the shoe, as well as the stitching on the little label, and then the, I think it's, I don't know what the end of those laces are called. I should know it. There's a name for the ends of the shoelaces. I colored those white as well. So once that is done, I can set that aside for that ink to dry, or that pen to dry. And next we're ready to start creating our card with that Everyday MVP stitching die of the month. So I have most of my hat die cut out of some Cascade cardstock. I have a few details cut out of Cosmic Sky cardstock. There is a couple sentiments that you can pick and choose from in this, or sentiment banners. So for that sentiment banner that I chose, I have the upper layer cut with Cosmic Sky and the lower layer cut with Cascade. I glued those together so they can be drying while I'm doing my stitching. Anytime I'm doing stitching, I will regularly have the die cut that I'm going to stitch, as well as one to glue underneath it. That way I can glue or seal the floss in between those pieces before assembling my card. In my opinion, it makes the card assembly much easier, as well as giving a little bit of extra dimension. For all of the stitching on all of these pieces, I am going up one hole, down the next, up the next, and then going back to that second hole, or then one previous, to fill in those areas. So I'm filling in all of my stitches at the same time. Another option would be to do a running stitch, which is going up one hole, down the other, up next, up, down the next. And then once you get to the end of the line, going back and filling in all of those spaces. Either one of those will get the same look, but I want to make sure that I have all of my stitching holes finished. I use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape in order to seal my floss, or tape the ends of my floss when I start. And I also do that same thing when I finish. And once I'm finished each piece, I use a little bit of that Barely Art glue in the fine line bottle to glue those pieces together. And then I use some sewing clips in order to hold those pieces together and let those dry while I'm working on my next pieces. So those clips free up my hands. I don't have to hold anything in place. It holds them perfectly for me so that I have those pieces, or that floss, sealed in between those two pieces. So for this particular die set, there are 3 different pieces that are stitched: the brim of the hat, the top of the hat, and then there's a label that goes on to the front. And I'm doing the stitching for all of them in exactly the same way. For this particular one, I chose some DMC Floss 796. It's a nice dark blue. It coordinates closest to the Cosmic Sky cardstock that I'm using for the accents on here. And I wanted it to be a color that was contrasting or darker than the base of the hat. I wanted it to be completely visible. And that for all of them, I'm doing exactly the same stitching, making sure that all of those areas are filled in, as well as cutting an extra piece and gluing those 2 pieces together so that my floss is completely sealed. It's much easier to glue a card together with solid cardstock behind it than with those floss pieces, because the floss gives it some dimension and it makes that glue not stick quite as easily. So by putting it or doing them like this, like I said before, I give it a little bit of extra dimension, but that also means I have solid cardstock on the back when I am assembling everything together. Now for my top of my hat, with those pieces drying with those sewing clips on there, I can add the little details. So there's the top piece that goes right at the top of the hat, and then there's some eyelet hole pieces that go around. I put some glue on there and use my picker tool in order to pick up those die cuts in order to place them in place. Those can be drying while the layers to my hat are drying. Once those are all nice and dry, I'm using a little bit of Chip Sapphire Distress ink in order to ink blend around the outside edges and give it a little bit of visual dimension. This is one of those steps that you could miss if you want, but I think it just adds a lot to the finished look. After doing the ink blending around the outside edges of the patch for the front, there is an outer line piece or a larger piece to glue that to. I did that out of Cosmic Sky, glued those pieces together, as well as gluing the under part to the brim. And I did that in the darker color as well. I just love the look of the darker color, giving it a little bit more dimension, and that matches the floss color that I did my ink blending with. Now obviously you can pick and choose which colors go with your favorite teams, or whoever the recipient is, their favorite team. And then the patches to the front of the hat, there's a few different options there, so you can customize that little patch to whoever you're giving it to as well. So there's so many different options with it, but I really do think the stitching on this hat makes it, or takes it to the next level and totally finishes it off. I'm using one of the stamps from the Clear Stamp of the Month. This one says you're in a league of your own. I thought that worked perfectly with the hat. The little patch on the front I chose, it just says MVP, but you can pick Jad. There's a few different ones to pick for that. And then this particular sentiment, there is a banner strip that you can use to die cut it. You could probably use this same banner strip for some of the foiled sentiments or better pressed sentiments from that Edge FX. I didn't check to see if they're the same size, but I betcha they would work for that. Once I have that done, I wanted to create another Edge FX background that coordinated with the colors from this hat. I didn't want a foiled background for this because I kind of thought that would detract from the hat. So I chose to just do a very simple background with that Chip Sapphire Distress ink. It matches the darker colors in the hat, so I thought it would just be a nice finished background. It would all nicely coordinate. So I did that on some hammer mill cardstock and then trimmed that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then I'm going to do just a little bit of ink blending on there just to soften that background. You could leave the background as is, but I just thought the ink blending on that background would finish it off just a little bit better. And I concentrated that ink blending on around the outside edges and where that dot detail was. I left this center part still white. I still want to have the hat be the main focus as well as these sentiments. So I just did a little bit there on the outside edges. Once that is done, we're ready to start assembling our card. And again, a very simple card to put together. The thing that took the longest was really stitching the detail in that hat, but so worth it. So I glued that background to the base of the card, and then while my block is on there holding everything nice and flat, I'm going to add the sentiments. You can see that I'm doing 2 sentiments for this card. I really liked the You're in a League of Your Own stamp from the Good Times Clear Stamp of the Month, but I also liked I think the banner one that I chose was Glad You're on Our Team or something like that. I thought that one went perfectly with it. I love the text or texture of those banner sentiments, and there's no reason that you can't do more than one sentiment on the front of a card, especially when they work well together. So now I'm going to glue that hat to the center of the card and then let that completely dry there. We have a very simple card here, but it's got so much texture because of that stitching die and that stitching detail. For the next card, I'm concentrating on the #1 fan. This is the deluxe All Clubs Crate bonus item. So we have the #1 fan die cut here. I'm using one of the solid hot foiled backgrounds. So I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending on that background as well as my glove and the 2 sentiments there with the Sunset Pink Interference ink. Tie those all in together. You can see that because of the pink, I got a little bit more of a feminine touch here. And again, you can pick and choose based on your favorite sports teams. I don't really like sports. I don't really have a favorite team, so I just picked colors that I felt like picking and ones that I thought would be fun to use together. And I knew I wanted to use a solid hot foiled background here, and I wanted to use the sunset pink, so that's where my colors came for this. But I do really like the blue accents to go with it. I like the blue and the pink together there. So these pieces, once again, just like any of the layering dies, are really easy to put together. I lay them down on my desk to make sure that I have all of those pieces together, everything in place, close to where they're going to go, so that I can easily grab them and put things where they're supposed to go. A little outline for the hand here. This is where having a fine tip bottle for your glue is really going to come into handy. So you can put as little or as much glue as you need on there and then attach that to the base. And same with the number and the 1 sign, or the number sign and the #1 in this die set as well. Now, the #1 are the only options in this set, but you could easily use your favorite alphabet set that works for scale to create a sentiment on here, or you could use one of the stamp sentiments from the clear stamp of the month to create a custom sentiment on there as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending on the sleeve just with whatever ink is left on my Chip Sapphire brush there, and then I'm ready to assemble the card. Again, super simple card, and that solid hot foiled background just kind of gives it a lot of shine, and then the #1 fan die cuts give it a lot of texture. So I'm going to glue that background to there and then glue my sentiment or my die cut on there, and then lastly add the sentiment to that. So this one has 2 sentiments to it as well that were inked with that Sunset Pink Interference ink. One goes towards the top, one goes towards the bottom. Now, because of the solid hot foiling here, this background has a lot of flashiness to it. You could easily just use, say, that Sunset Pink on that Edge Effects and do it on white cardstock if that was a little bit too flashy for you or too much for you. I just really liked it on that background there, and I thought it worked well with that die cut. For my last card, I'm once again pulling out that stencil of the month, and we're going to ink blend it in exactly the same way that I've been doing throughout this video. So again, first layer starting with that Squeeze Lemonade Distress ink, being a little bit heavier towards the outside than the inside. Now, I will always start with this one with being a little bit more even with the yellow. It's more when I get to the Spice Marmalade and the Abandoned Coral that you see the heavier amount in the center. It's there with that Squeeze Lemonade as well, but just not quite as prominent as with the Spice Marmalade and the Abandoned Coral. So next layer is that Spice Marmalade, again, concentrating the heavier color towards the center. And then I basically just use whatever ink is left on my brush as well as on the stencil to kind of spread that out around to the outer edges there. Next, we're going to go in and do that Abandoned Coral. Now, again, I have the same colors that I am using for this background throughout the video. You can easily change it up. I often will kind of concentrate on a certain color palette when I'm creating the clubs videos and not really take too many color, try not to bring too many colors in there, but you can easily swap these out for different colors. I'm doing kind of pinks, oranges, yellows here, but I think it would also be really fun in a completely different color palette, like purples and blues and pinks. I think would look fantastic as well. Obviously would have a completely different look to it, but I think it would be fantastic as well. For this last layer, rather than doing that Sunset Pink, I am going to change it up. So I'm using that Lisa Horton Gold pad. This is that same pad that I used on my second card with the embossed Solar Flare. I had rubbed it on the top layers or the upper layers, the raised layers of that embossed background. For this one, I am using it on my last stencil, or the last one for that Sunburst for this particular background. Then I'm using the dot background there, taping that in place. Anytime I use these stencils, I do tape them in place to make sure that they're not going to move on me, because there's very little surface to hold it down with that sticky mat. This dotted one is where I'm going to use that Sunset Pink Interference ink. I didn't want to do too much of a contrast of color because of what I have planned to do next with it. So I'm using that Sunset Pink. It's going to coordinate beautifully with that background, but we did change it up. So the center of that Sunburst is that gold, as well as some of those rays being the gold. So again, the inks will just wash right off that stencil. Even that gold metallic ink will just rinse right off under water, so no special cleaner needed. Now for my next step, I want to make sure that these inks are nice and dry. So I'm using my embossing tool and going over that background to make sure that my inks are 100% dry before my next step. The way to test this after I've done it, and I think it's completely done, is I will put it on top, or I'll put some clear embossing powder on top of there to see if that embossing powder sticks anywhere. For my next step, I want to put some black embossing powder on there, and I want to make sure it only sticks where I want it to. So I want to make sure that there's nothing wet for that powder to stick to and end up needing to be cleaned off. So there was a tiny little area on one of those dotted parts that needed a little bit more of that heat tool on there. I rubbed that embossing powder off of there to make sure it wasn't there, and then used my heat tool on there. And then tested it one more time just to make sure that that embossing powder wasn't going to stick anywhere. This is the easiest way to make sure that everything is completely dry. You could use some embossing powder tool on there, but even that, sometimes it doesn't completely take any possible moisture away from there. So once again, I'm pulling out that Edge Effects plate. Again, you can see that I really loved this plate and used it in many different ways because I just love the different looks that it gives. I'm going to use it in my Better Press system, but this time I'm going to heat emboss with it. So I placed it on there, placed my stenciled background on there. And then I am going to use some embossing ink on my plate. I'm using some Versamark ink there. I don't have to use embossing powder tool on my stencil background because I just checked it with clear embossing powder. I know that it's not the embossing powder that I'm going to be using is not going to stick anywhere else that I don't want it to go. So I inked my plate, put that clear plate to the base, ran it through my die cutting machine here to press that image in. And now I'm going to use this background with some black embossing powder. It's going to have some really nice contrast with that embossed or that stenciled background with all those nice bright colors there. So I'm using superfine embossing powder. Anytime I use my press plate, when possible, I use superfine powder because some of those details are really, really fine. So I find that the superfine embossing powder gets that detail much better. You can see that I'm coming to the end of my jar here of that powder. So I'll put that excess powder from my scrap paper into the jar and pour it back on there again. There must have been a corner there that I missed with my Versamark ink because you can see that it's not sticking, but that's okay. And we're going to heat emboss this, and then I'm going to trim it down, and then I'm going to rub the edges of this cardstock around with some Versamark ink so that I can put some of that black embossing powder around all of those edges and frame it really nicely. That's one of the great thing about mixed media style backgrounds like this. It doesn't need to be perfect. So if there's an area that gets missed with ink or with embossing powder in this case, there are typically ways to fix it to make it look like it's meant to be. And sometimes, like if you didn't know that there was supposed to be ink on that top right corner there, it wouldn't be that big of a deal because there's so much randomness to that background. So I'm trimming this down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then once again, using that Versamark pad. Now I'm not doing this second step here because of that ink not showing up in the corner. I had planned to do this anyways, because I wanted to make sure that cutting through that embossing powder or that embossed edge wasn't going to give it a weird look at the end. So I had already planned on putting that Versamark around the edges to make sure we have a nice curved edge. Doing embossing around the edges of cardstock is one of the ways that I love framing things in. It creates a really interesting look. It's not perfect. You're not going to get a completely even line all the way around. So it's kind of a fun way to get metallic or whatever embossing you use, look around the outside edges that has a little bit of randomness to it. For the sentiment for this card, I chose one of the sentiment plates in that Edge Effects set, and I'm going to heat emboss it on black cardstock. So I'm going to heat emboss this with white embossing powder on black cardstock. I did use some embossing powder tool on there. I want to make sure that my white embossing powder only sticks to that Versamark ink sentiment, and I want to make sure that we have a nice crisp sentiment there. So once I press that sentiment in place, I put that super fine white embossing powder on there. If by chance there's an area that that embossing powder sticks to that I don't want it to, I will use a soft brush to clean it off to make sure that I have a nice crisp sentiment there. Then I'm going to heat emboss that with my heat tool, and I'm going to use my trimmer to trim that down. I did wait a few seconds before trimming it down. I want to make sure that that embossing powder is nice and cooled and is not still hot and a little bit liquid. So I did wait a few moments. Then I trim my sentiment down. I thought this sentiment was going to look nice on with a white sentiment on black in the center of the cardstock. That black is going to echo the black around the outside of my background here, and the white is going to echo the card base. And again, super simple card design, but we've got so much detail there between that stenciled background, that press plate embossed detail around the outside edge, and then our very simple sentiment. And the sentiment just says the sky's the limit, which I think works perfect with the stenciled image because it definitely looks like a sunburst or sun something in the sky. So I really love the look of that, and so much texture between that embossing as well as that gold ink in the background and the interference ink in the background. Then we have our number 1 fan card with that solid foiled background there, as well as the interference inks giving them just a little bit of shimmer. Our MVP stitched hat there. And again, this easily can be changed to whatever your favorite team colors are. So I think there's so many different possibilities there to customize it for your recipient. The kicks, the classic kicks cards, one with the ombre colorful shoe here, as well as the other one with the foiled shoe and the florals. This is another one that I think can be customized in so many different ways. It's such a fun one for so many different people. I love that solid hot foiled background behind that as well. It adds, or it coordinates with the foiled sentiments in those pieces. Then we have our Backyard Barbecue King card there, or Barbecue Boss, sorry, with those barbecue utensils, and then our Unstoppable with the galaxy type background. The foiled accents just coordinate really well with the shimmery accents from the interference inks in the background. And then our Daytime one, Unstoppable, with the little swinging legs there. Such an easy feature to do, but it's so fun to have or to create interference cards, especially when they're easy, simple interference cards to create. And I love the stencil background to that one. There's so much extra detail that gets included with it when you have a stenciled pattern background like that. Then we have our stencil background with the Solar Flare embossing folder in the month. So we have that detail from the stenciling as well as the detail from the embossing. And then our very first card using that urban grid with the everyday or the sentiments from the press and foil plate, as well as the florals from the classic kicks. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.